so many people here for the first evening event of this week. And the aim of this week, called Tomorrow, which I'm sort of blocking, is really to create a space to talk about our hopes, fears, longings, questions about the future, about tomorrow, as individuals but also as a society. And particularly we're going to be digging into the Christian claims about this and investigating what bearing the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ might have on these questions that we have today. So we're going to have, particularly today, we're going to be focusing on themes of truth and humility. In 2016, post-truth was named the word of the year. So have we moved beyond truth claims altogether, left them behind for good? Isn't it arrogant and just false for Christians to claim a monopoly on the truth about God, about us and about the world? Well, to explore these themes with us today is Michael Ramsden. Michael is an internationally renowned speaker who grew up in the Middle East, but also works in Oxford at the moment. And he's going to be joined with us, he's going to be with us all week, every evening from Monday to Friday, and he's brought along a load of his friends. And today we're going to be hearing from Sharon Dirckx, Dr Sharon Dirckx, and Michael's going to interview her. And then I'll come back up, we'll do a bit of a rearrange, and then Michael's going to speak to us on this question of, is the Christian faith inherently arrogant? So why don't you join me in welcoming these two people behind me, Michael and Dr Sharon Dirckx.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's great to be with you this evening, and also Sharon, great to have you here as well. I think we first met almost 20 years ago. We were both 3 years old, I think, at the time.
That's right, we aged very, very gracefully.
Yeah. Now, I know you, when you went off to university, you did biochemistry, but as you headed off to university, were you a Christian? I mean, how would you have described yourself at that point?
Yeah, I think I probably would have described myself as a happy agnostic. I actually knew very little about the Christian faith. I barely went to Sunday school, maybe a handful of times growing up, and I knew very little. I wasn't aware that there was any kind of Christian union in my school or anything like that. So I arrived, I remember being, had quite a good friendship with my biology teacher, and she at one point at the age of 17 handed me this book called The Selfish Gene, and as Michael said, this was 20 years ago, and so this book had just come out, and so I read this book about how we were kind of, genetic automatons and purely physical machines, and just kind of absorbed it, really, having, in the absence of anything else, I just absorbed this narrative about life, and I took it with me to Bristol University.
So what happened while you were there then to change your minds? And what was that process then for you becoming a Christian?
Yeah, so I went to an event known as Guerrilla Christian in Freshers Week, which has nothing to do with barbecuing, although they did used to barbecue Christians, and who knows, maybe they will again at some point in the future.
We're not recommending that now, so next week.
But it was a panel of 4 Christians, and you could basically ask them any question you wanted, and I had just arrived to study biochemistry, and I think I'd absorbed from somewhere in the ether, and probably from The Selfish Gene and other places, that surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. And so I put my hand up and asked that question, and the answer that I was given was very simple. Obviously there's more that can be said on this, but they said, no, basically you can, and these disciplines are asking different questions about different things, and of course you can have them both together. And having had no exposure to the Christian faith or anything like that, this was rocket science for me, and it set me on an 18-month journey of asking more questions, of grilling a lot more Christians, many of whom were my flatmates in my second year, so I asked a lot more questions, the kinds of questions that we're looking at this week, and eventually got to the point, although I didn't have all of them exhaustively answered, I came to the conclusion that actually the person of Jesus was not only historically reliable and real, but actually that he did die and rise from the dead. And I decided about halfway through this degree to begin to follow him, and that was 20 years ago, and I have never regretted that decision. I've never been in a place where I wanted to sort of back out of that. It has actually enabled me to better understand the world, better understand myself, better understand what it means to be a scientist and to live as a full, whole human being, and so that it was life-changing.
Yeah. Now, we'll come back in a minute. We'll skip forward a little bit because I know you want to do a doctorate and postdoctoral research. And I think when we first met, you were doing that over at Oxford because you condescended to bring your brilliant education that you did a PhD level from here over there to help that city. So you must have been asked the question quite a lot, but you're a scientist, you're a research scientist, you're a biochemist. How can you believe this?
Yeah.
So how do you go about answering that question now when people put that to you?
So it's a little bit like asking someone, okay, choose between these two reasons as to why Microsoft Office exists. Either because programming languages have been invented or because Bill Gates exists. Choose. And you look at that for 1 nanosecond and you say, well, you don't need to choose. One is describing the underlying mechanisms and the other is describing the person whose idea it was and who set it in motion and continues to uphold it today. And there's no logical conflict between believing in Bill Gates and Java or C script. And in the same way, there's no logical conflict between examining the amazing, incredible world that we live in and all of its natural processes and belief in God who set it all in motion, whose idea it was. Those are his mechanisms, and so it's actually, there's no logical conflict. In fact, it's worth asking the question, not only is there not any conflict, but how is it that science is even possible? And why is it that there is an underlying order to the natural world so that you can repeat things and test things? Well, many of the pioneers in the modern scientific revolution were theists, whose science was driven forwards by the belief that there was order in nature because God exists. Because God existed, they expected to find order in nature. And you could also ask the question, well, why are we able to think rationally? Because science is only possible on the basis that there's order in nature and there's order in the human mind, and there's all kinds of explanations offered today as to where our minds come from and how they came to be. But if God doesn't exist, you're in some ways chalking it all down to non-rational processes. Well, why on earth should you expect non-rational processes to yield rational thoughts? Is that really the best explanation for the human mind that you can come up with? And actually, you can make a really strong case that we have a mind because God does. We think because he does. And so, not only is there no conflict between God and science, but you can make a case that it's the existence of God that makes science possible. Because the order in nature and the order in the human mind are both traceable to him, a rationally intelligent being known as God. I believe that God welcomes us into the lab. He was there first, it was his idea, and he's very much for science.
Now, you've been talking about the mind, and I know when you came here to your PhD, that's something you got very interested in. So what was your PhD in?
So I moved from biochemistry because I loved the discoveries of biochemistry, but I didn't particularly enjoy the practice of pipetting tiny amounts of material into water baths and leaving it there for 3 months, and then you have electricity cut and you've lost the last 6 months of work and you've got to start again, and the yeasty kind of smell that went around the place. And I actually developed... And I
apologise for that now. I had dinner.
Thank you. And I actually began to pursue brain imaging, particularly functional MRI of the human brain, and that led me via an internship in Switzerland working in industry to Cambridge to here, and I did a PhD in functional MRI out at Addenbrooke's at the Wolfson Brain Imaging Centre. Anybody familiar with that here? Yeah, okay, one, two of you.
Two.
Two.
And the rest of you are wondering what they're talking about.
Yes. So this is a technique that allows you to look inside the brain without cutting into it, and it revolutionised neuroscience in the midway through the 20th century, because until then you were limited to disease states or post-mortem studies of people, but the advent of brain imaging meant that you can now study healthy volunteers as well, and that really bolstered and boosted the advance of our study of the brain.
And what did you learn, do you think, during that time, both about the brain and also about your newfound faith in God?
Yeah, I mean, my PhD wasn't very exciting, and I'll let you into that secret. It was at a time when functional MRI was just getting going. People were really trying to figure out how these scanners worked and what kind of images came out, and so I was looking at the effect of hematocrit on the type of signals that you get during with functional MRI. But I also learned, so I was a Christian by this point. I've been a Christian for about 2 years, and I really learned the lesson of the fact that the creator of the universe is the creator of the universe, but they care about the fact that I'm sitting here typing numbers into a computer. The mundane things of life matter to the creator of the universe. And that was actually a really key lesson for me. I learned all kinds of other things about how to forgive, how to receive forgiveness, how to start each day new, and I learned all kinds of things.
Now, I know you've just finished writing a book, I think your second book, Am I Just My Brain?
Yes.
And that's a question that we increasingly hear now as we wrestle with what does it mean to be human, how do we actually understand that?
Yes.
So what are the things that you've sort of discovered there? How's that challenge your thinking?
Yeah. So there's a view out there that I'm not convinced it's held by a majority of neuroscientists and philosophers, but it is held by a small number of very vocal ones, which is that you are your brain. Your brain drives everything about you, your decisions, your thinking, even your religious beliefs, and you are your brain essentially. And I'm wanting to challenge and critique that, to say, is that really the best understanding of what it means to be a person? You know, if your brain determines who you are, then what happens when your brain starts to decline, which it kind of does beyond about this age. You're on your peak now.
And that's the good news we're sharing with you this evening. It's all downhill from here.
Yeah. And what about in someone with a neurodegenerative disease? Do you become less of a person as your brain degenerates? There are huge implications behind this question, and not just for the neuroscientist and philosopher, for all of us. And I've actually, I'm looking at philosophy, neuroscience, and medicine to say, what other explanations are there? And do they make a better account of the human person? So in the clinic, you see that there are some patients with massive chunks of their brain missing, but still really intact minds. And you've got neuroscientists like Wilder Penfield, who stimulated all these areas of the human cortex, but never stimulated a person to have an abstract thought or make a decision. And on that basis, changed from being a materialist to a dualist, to say, actually, there is more going on here. And so I look at two different views, which is that actually, well, what is this thing, the mind, and how does it relate to the brain? You know, how do you get from neurons to thoughts? And that is the million-dollar question that philosophers have debated for centuries. And I offer two, largely summarizing huge areas, two possible alternatives to you are your brain, which is that the brain generates the mind, so the mind emerges from the brain, and there's a very close link between them. But then you also have to then say, well, when the brain dies, what happens to the mind? And there are all kinds of studies now from near-death experiences, systematic studies by cardiologists where people are in a state of clinical death requiring surgery, and then they report consciousness during this surgery, suggesting that in a state of brain death, they are still conscious, they still have a mind of some sort. How do you make sense of that kind of data? And so that leads me to a third view, which is to say that actually the mind is beyond the brain, that there are two distinct entities, the mind and the brain, and the mind can exist without the brain if necessary. And but they are both obviously dependent on each other and interacting very closely. And it all points, again to the kind of thing that I was saying earlier, that what is the origin of the mind? What is the origin of human consciousness? Well, if you believe that nature is all that there is, then your search for the origins of human consciousness will remain within the natural world. But what if the origins of consciousness lie beyond nature? And that is the point that really I make towards the end of the book, that we are conscious because God is conscious and has extended that consciousness beyond himself to people, that actually your mind is given you by God. He is not anti-intellectual. He gave you the mind that you have, and that's part of what it means to be made in the image of God, made by God.
Now, I know you did postdoctoral research looking at people in the British state, and you were involved with a team that actually based out of Cambridge, but then made the headlines when they published that.
Yes.
But you've also written a book on suffering. I guess maybe part inspired by that, but I also know you've been through a lot of personal sort of challenges on that side as well, in the context of your family.
Yes.
So just share a few little thoughts about that, and maybe wrap it up with, for people who are here and wondering, have questions about God.
Yes.
What would you want to share and say to them as well?
Yes.
If I sort of combine those two things
Combine
together.
those two things, absolutely. So, I wrote a book on suffering around with the question why as its title, because I think at the heart our cry, our questions, our shouts, whatever they are, centre around this question, why? And if God exists, then why? Why is this happening? Why did this happen? And as Michael said, this is not just an intellectual question for any of us, and not least myself, because my husband, who I met in a brain imaging lab, I should just very romantic. The brain imaging lab just down the road from here.
He had a very beautiful brain.
Has a neurological condition that doesn't have a name. We live in an age where we're told that science and medicine can answer every question that we have. Well, that isn't the case for us. And so we mostly live a normal life, but every once in a while, I'd say maybe 2 or 3% of the time, we descend into this state where his neurological condition takes over for 3 or 4 weeks, and we're trying to sort of manage that. We've discovered that cranial osteopathy seems to relieve the symptoms, but we still, 30 years on, don't understand what it is, what causes it, how to predict it. And so that's very frustrating for two scientists to be in that situation. And so, at the heart of our questions on suffering, if you're asking why, if you have ever asked why, it raises an interesting thought. To whom are you addressing the question? Because if God doesn't exist, there's no one to ask. And so where has your why question come from? If nature is all that there is, then disease is a cause and effect. It is a chance activity of billions of DNA molecules occasionally making errors. There's nothing wrong as such. But to ask why is to imply that there is something wrong. And that very sense of wrongness makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. Because the Christian faith says that God has made a world good, but in which something has gone wrong, because evil also exists. Evil objectively exists and is ultimately behind the suffering in this world. And so it gives vent, it gives home to your why question, rather than being a reason to point away from God. And then obviously right at the heart of the Christian faith is a God who has not left us alone in our suffering, but has actually fully entered into it as the person of Jesus, and has suffered horrifically, not only like us, but also for us on a cross, and somehow has suffered in ways that go way beyond anything that we can ever imagine. The Christian faith speaks of a God who somehow it's not just physical, psychological, emotional suffering that he was going through. There was a spiritual and cosmic level to it where all the world's evil was being aimed at this one target to somehow take the wind out of its sails. Because if you can nail one person who doesn't contain any evil and pin all the world's evil on them, then somehow there might be a way to take the wind out of the sails of evil. And that's really what was happening there, that Jesus died so that we don't have to. Ultimately, he took evil into himself so that evil doesn't have to have the last word in our lives. And that has been my experience. Things that I thought would sink me haven't. Things that I never thought I'd make it through the other side, somehow I have. There is forgiveness you didn't think you were able to receive. There is strength that you never knew that you had. There is hope that you never thought was available in the person of Jesus Christ, the God who has not left you alone in your suffering, but has stepped into human history and says, I will walk with you through this. Would you like me to? But he will always respect our freedom. He will not override it or overrule it. But he always offers us a choice. You can go through this without me or with me. And that is the choice that's available to you.
Thank you, Sharon. We really appreciate it. Why don't we thanks to Sharon? She made the right
Well, it's really wonderful to be here with you this evening, and Sharon's graciously agreed to stay on for about half an hour at the end of this event, and then she'll have to make her way all the way back over to Oxford. They need her help and presence as much as they can get. But I'll also, at the end of this talk, I'll be hanging around as long as it need be to answer any questions that may come up as a result of what I share with you this evening. So please do feel free to come up and ask me any question. If you want to be at the front of the line and you're holding a chocolate bar, you will be prioritised. I am susceptible to that sort of influence. It is, the question that we're dealing with this evening about is the Christian faith inherently arrogant is actually a very important one. It's impossible to put your trust in someone or something which you think is seriously morally flawed. Sometimes when we talk about the concept of faith or the notion of it, what we assume is we're talking about something which is very abstract, some form of philosophical speculation, which you arrive at in the absence of any form of conviction or evidence, which is one of the reasons I thought it may be interesting to hear from Sharon this evening. But actually, when you talk about having faith in a person, if I were to say to you, look, I have faith in Sharon, I'm not saying anything at a speculative level. I'm not saying that at a metaphysical level I want to postulate an ontological entity labelled Sharon, and I further wish to assert that somehow I'm right in thinking about her. When I say I have faith in Sharon, I'm saying two things. I'm first of all making a statement about reality. She actually exists, even if I didn't want her to exist. Tough. Just because I stop believing in her or liking her, she doesn't cease to pop out of existence. She's still there. And just think how happy some people would be in the realm of politics if by stopping believing in them, they'll simply disappear. So when I talk about having faith in Sharon, and first of all, it's a statement about reality. Is she actually there? Is she real? And the second question is about her trustworthiness. Can I rely on her? Can I trust her? If she makes a promise and says, yeah, sure, Michael, I'll make the long drive all the way over from Oxford to Cambridge to be with you on Monday night, will she show up? And if she does show up and she's true to her word over a consistent period of time, I feel, well, I can trust her. And so the thing that allows me to think about putting my faith, does it make sense, in her is to do with those two things. And that's why we talk about a faithful friend, or we may even refer to an unfaithful lover. What we're saying is, well, look, they either keep their word or they don't. They're real. And when the Bible uses the word faith, that's the only sense in which it really employs it. It's to put your faith in someone, namely God. So the question then about, is there something inherently arrogant about believing in God or being a Christian is actually very important, because you can't fully trust something or someone that you feel is immoral in some way. So if you and I became friends and all of a sudden you realize that I was somehow manipulating you or maybe abusing someone else, that knowledge about the kind of person I am would mean that you would break that bond of trust which is marked out by friendship. You would no longer trust me in that way. You would no longer think about me in that way. And so actually this question is really important, because if we can't answer it in a satisfactory way, we become then very justified in asking some very serious questions about whether this is the kind of thing to put your faith in, and whether the God of the Bible is the kind of God to put your faith in, even if it is true. Some people sometimes think the philosopher Nietzsche was an out-and-out atheist, but that's not strictly true. He actually argued that even if God does exist, we're morally justified in fighting against him, because we're in a morally superior position to him. And there is therefore a very strong, important element to this particular question. Now, what I'd love to do is just make a few comments, and then I would like to look at how Jesus Christ answered this question, because interestingly enough, Jesus Christ answered this question head on. And we'll be looking at how he did that out of the Gospel of Luke in these little books we have in about 5 minutes' time. But let me make just a few introductory comments as we go in. Whenever we talk about arrogance, we very often connect it to this whole idea of truth. And if you weren't here this lunchtime, then I'm pretty sure that the talk was recorded this lunchtime. I'm looking for someone to nod at me and say that's true. And you missed a brilliant talk by Pete. And go and do listen to it, because he also spoke to this subject matter very, very eloquently and very well this lunchtime. But I guess that the struggle that we have at that philosophical level is, but if I'm saying this is true, aren't I in some way making some kind of exclusive claim? And you're struggling with that. And we don't like that idea at a philosophical level. But the simple truth is, whenever we assert anything that we believe, we're going to be excluding somebody. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I wasn't even raised in a Christian culture. And when I finally became a Christian and then moved country as an older teenager to a country called Cyprus, that was the first time I really had the freedom to explore these kinds of questions, because in Saudi Arabia that freedom really wasn't there. And I can remember shortly after I became a Christian, my English teacher at the time came up to me and said, "Michael, I'm so happy that you've become a Christian, and I'm the leader of the Baha'i faith in this country." And I had no idea who the Baha'i were or whatever, so I asked some questions, and he was a very wonderful guy at many levels. And he said, "What we believe is that all paths lead to God. It doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you're sincere." And I remember saying to him, "Well, what about if someone said there's only one path to God? Would you accept that?" He said, No, we could never accept that." I said, "So you're excluding me?" He said, No, not at all. We include everybody." I said, "Well, do you include the idea that there's only one way?" He said, "No, we couldn't possibly include that." I said, "Well, I'm being excluded again." And at a very early, I think I've been a Christian for about 2 days, I began to wrestle now with this dilemma. It's mirrored in one sense, if you like, therefore, with the moral struggle we have with anybody making a claim to truth, which is also linked up with the exclusivity. I can remember a couple of years later after that, I was giving a very short talk. People normally like me to give very short talks. So this was a 15-minute talk followed by a 2-hour Q&A. And at the end of 2 hours of question and answers, this lady came up to me and thanked me for everything. And at the end she said, "Look, I would like to ask you a question that you didn't address publicly, but it seemed to be assumed in a lot of your answers." I said, "Well, please ask the question." She said, "Well, do you think that Jesus Christ makes some kind of exclusive claim?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And she said, "Well, I could never become a morally abhorrent person like that and that's why I'm not a Christian, that's why I'm a Buddhist." And I looked at her. She was asking a very good question. And I said, "Tell me," I said, "I don't know as much about Buddhism as you do, but didn't the Buddha say that the Hindus were wrong? Didn't he say that the Vedas, which are the Hindu scriptures, are twisted and wrong? And didn't he also call the caste system, which is at the center of Hinduism, evil?" And her mouth fell a bit open, and she said, "He did say that. I read it this morning in my devotions." I said, "Well, if you're prepared to follow the Buddha when he said other people are wrong, why are you not prepared to follow Jesus Christ if he implies other people are wrong?" And she looked at me and she said, "I'm not happy with where this is going." and I said, I appreciate your struggle, but you see the point. Whenever we stake a truth claim, if it's true, by definition, it has consequences. So if I were to stand up in front of you tonight and say all paths lead to God, then at the same time I'm saying, look, those of you who believe only some paths lead to God or only one path lead to God would be in error. Similarly, if I were to say, look, only some paths lead to God, because I'm not sure Adolf Hitler had such a great plan of salvation for the world, so I want to exclude some of them. So if I say, look, only some people have the true path to God, I'm implying that those who say all or only one are wrong. No matter how you state the claim at some point, we're going to exclude someone somewhere, and that's partly how truth works. The question, therefore, actually goes to one of attitude, because you can hold the truth in a very arrogant way, and you can also hold the truth in a very humble kind of way. It's not the truth that's the problem, it's the heart that's adjoined to it that really raises the question. Which is one of the reasons I remember I loved Sharon from the very first time I met her and got talking to her. He was this brilliant research scientist at the time working at Oxford. And, unlike, I'm sure you have the saying here, academics, brain the size of a planet, ego the size of two. And just seeing that gentleness there. So it's one thing to actually hold on to truth or claim to have it. The other question is, well, what's the attitude in the heart that's attendant to it? And actually, you see that expressed, the danger, if you like, of what happens when the wrong attitude is addressed to any claim for truth. In a quote I remember reading a little while ago from an academic by the name of Isaiah Berlin, who was this incredible polymath who studied in all kinds of areas and came from a very rich philosophical tradition. If you've never read any of Isaiah Berlin's essays, regardless of what your academic interest is in, I would encourage you, pick it up and have a look through. He was an incredibly eloquent and also insightful writer. And one of his huge concerns in one of his big academic areas was to do with the nature of freedom in society. And having been raised in the East and seen what happened when socialism and communism came and shut down his countries, and all of a sudden freedom of thought was lost, and indeed freedom began to be lost, when he had to flee over to live in the West to find academic freedom and also just social freedom, he gave a lot of thought to how is it possible for entire societies to somehow become enslaved. And here's one of the things which he said, and it's very interesting. He said, the enemy of pluralism, which for him is one of the essential things you have to hold on to have a free society. He said, the enemy of pluralism is monism, the ancient belief that there is a single harmony of truths into which everything, if it is genuine, in the end must fit. The consequence of this belief is that those who know should command those who do not. To cause pain, to kill, to torture are in general rightly condemned. But if these things are not done for my personal benefit, but for an ism, socialism, nationalism, fascism, communism, fanatically held religious belief or progress, or the fulfillment of the laws of history, then they are in order. And then he goes on to make one last statement. He says, monism is one step away from despotism. Do you see what he's saying? What he's saying is, if you believe that in the end there's one form of truth which somehow sits above everything else, you're just one step away from despotism. You will assume that you should take power and command everyone who doesn't know and acknowledge that truth. And that is how you'll see collapse of freedom in society. And I think there's a huge insight that he brings that we need to remember, especially in our current day and age. But I remember the very first time I ever read that essay, when I got to the end of it, I remember writing at the bottom, what about a truth filled with grace? Because one of the most profound statements that hit me the first time I ever read one of the gospel accounts about the life of Jesus Christ was Jesus Christ was described as someone as full of truth and grace. Now, when you describe someone as being graceful, what you mean is there's a beauty to their physical movement. And you would have noticed that as I walked up onto this platform to speak to you. But when you describe someone as gracious, you're saying there's a beauty to their inner moral movement. You're saying there is something very beautiful about the way in which they conduct themselves. And Jesus Christ was someone who was full of truth and grace, and you see it in the way in which he dealt and encountered with people. But this does raise the question, which I think can legitimately be put against Christians, which is this. Well, look, you Christians seem to be awfully sure. You seem to be very certain about this idea about being with God and spending eternity with God and all that kind of stuff. And isn't there an inherent arrogance in that? I mean, how can you think that you're so good that God somehow wants to get you and have you with him? In other words, if I were to stand up in front of you tonight and my opening statement was, I want to tell all of you this evening that I know for sure I'm going to heaven, and then pause there and give all of you a piece of paper and ask you to write down what you thought about me at that point, you would probably use words like arrogant, self-assured, narcissistic, pompous. In some cultures they would look at me and they'll say, well, that's partly being English. Whatever it is, you would hear something very negative. And I say, what is interesting is that Jesus actually addressed this question head on, and you'll find it in these little booklets, what he had to say about this on page 58 of these little Gospels of Luke, one of the first eyewitness accounts of Jesus Christ. And on page 58, you'll see there in bold, there's a little thing that says the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And we see and hear of this encounter in Jesus' life. And this is how it starts. It says, to some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told them this parable. So if you want to know what Jesus had to say about arrogant self-righteousness, he answers it specifically here. to everybody who felt that somehow they were better, superior to everybody else, and looked down on them from that high and lofty position, Jesus told them a story. Now the story, the parable he tells, is actually remarkably profound, and we may just need to take a moment just to dig into it to actually recover the profundity of what he said, because by the time he finished telling this particular parable, the people, the audience listening to him, would have been quite stunned by what he had said. So Jesus said, look, there were two men, and they went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now, in most Semitic languages including Aramaic and so on that Jesus spoke, when you say, I'm going to the temple to pray, it means one of two things. It means, A, you're going to this large religious space on your own, entirely privately, when no one else is there, to find a quiet corner and pray just by yourself. Or the same phrase is used to describe going to an act of public worship. You're going to the temple when there are lots of other people there, and there's a big service going on, a bit like if you came to this church on a Sunday morning. You would find a lot of people here. And the question is, well, which of the two is it? And the answer is, well, the context will answer that for you. And what we can know with pretty much complete certainty is that it's the second setting. These two guys, they go up to the temple together, they pray at the same time, they leave together, but you'll see when we get into the second prayer that's uttered that what Jesus is saying very much implies they're in this act of public worship. So they both go up to the temple when this act of public worship is going on. And they both pray. Now the Pharisee, the great religious leader, who sort of feels very morally self-assured, one of sort of the key, if you like, sort of like lay members of the religious community who would pride themselves on how well they keep the rules and how well respected they are, he offers a prayer. Now, why do they pray? Well, the answer is that in the temple every morning and every evening there was a service in the temple in Jerusalem. And a lamb was sacrificed for the forgiveness of sins. And after this act, the priest who was in charge would turn around and he would disappear through a curtain at the back, and he would offer prayers and burn incense for the people outside. At this point, the people outside, they're just looking at an empty platform, there's nobody there. So there was space in the liturgy, if you like, at this point to offer up your own prayers. And you can actually see this in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. In Luke chapter 1, if you go to the beginning of the book and have a read of this on your own, you will see that it says when it fell to Zachariah's turn to come to the burning of incense, while he was in there burning incense, everybody stood outside praying. Well, of course, that's what you did. This was the opportunity now, the break in the service, where there's nothing actually going on for you to see or participate in that way. So now you can offer up your own personal prayers. And so in the same location, this Pharisee, this very religious guy, he offers up his prayers, and it's sort of clothed in a form of fake humility. He says, God, thank you for making me better than everybody else. It's very subtle. Have you noticed it? He's not claiming at one level it's anything to do with him. God has made me better than everyone else. Thank you, God, for giving me this superior position and ability. But actually at the heart of what he has to say and what he says next is actually incredibly proud and self-assured. He says, I thank you, I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. In other words, what he's saying is, loudly, and to obviously everyone else's benefit, I'm not like the rest of you. You poor, foolish people who are doing all kinds of stuff you shouldn't be doing. God, thank you that you've made me better than all of them. And thank you that I'm also doing more than you require, because I'm fasting twice a week and I'm tithing every single aspect of everything that I get and giving it back to you. And so look how well I'm doing. And I don't spend too much time talking about this particular form of prayer because I find it a little bit depressing. You may do too. It's an amazing observation. The guy is in the place where God is meant to be worshipped. He's saying, God, I'm doing everything you want me to do. I'm keeping the rules, I'm following the system, I'm doing everything you've told me to do. Look how great I am. Now, the second prayer is the one that I want to just major on a little bit, because the tax collector, who is also standing there, and I'm afraid to say that people who've worked for whatever Inland Revenue Service have never been particularly popular in any culture they've lived in. If you are thinking of doing that now, post-graduation, then may the Lord bless you. But the tax collector, he stood at a distance, and he does not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said. Now, this description is actually really important. In different cultures, when people pray, they pray in different ways. So if you're in a formal Anglican type service and they say, let us pray, you may very often sort of get down on your knees, in my sense, and you sort of look down like that, okay, if they have little cushions in old-style churches. In the Jewish synagogue, when you say, let us pray, you open your hands and you look up to heaven because you're directing your prayer to God, which does beg the question why some people like to get on their knees and look down, because someone else is meant to be living down there. But that's a whole other issue that we won't even get into. But he won't look up. He feels too ashamed to look up. It's a very interesting thing. I'm sure none of you have had this experience that I had when I was a university student doing a law degree. But if you're ever walking through your faculty and you haven't done an essay and all of a sudden you see the tutor to whom you're meant to hand that essay in, you have this overwhelming desire to look down at the ground and then walk into whatever room is next to you, even if it's got nothing to do with you whatsoever. Until they've gone, you don't feel the ability to look them in the eye. It's very interesting, isn't it? At the most subconscious level, when we feel that somehow there's something wrong, we struggle to look somebody in the eye. And we just find ourselves looking away or looking to go somewhere else. And we can have that all the way from the embarrassment of maybe a minor unresolved thing that we're slightly ashamed of, and it's just a little bit awkward, and we see the person who's somehow involved in that, and we just don't want to be with them, all the way to when we've sometimes done very terrible things, and we just don't want to be in that person's presence anymore. So he won't even look up. And he beats his breast. Now, for someone who was raised in the Middle East, this is a very interesting image, because male characters in this Middle Eastern culture, they don't act this way. You may see this on some of the funerals that sometimes get televised on TV if you watch BBC World News or CNN or something. But when there are these mass funerals, you'll very often see guys shooting their guns into the air. And you'll see women beating their breasts, and they do a form of wailing, where their voices go up and down, and you may have heard it, or if you've ever been to that part of the world, maybe even witnessed it firsthand. And so it's very unusual to read of a guy beating their breast. That would be considered unusual in this culture, which is why Jesus, I think, uses that description. This guy won't look up, and not only simply won't look up, he feels distraught. And he's beating his breast. And he's looking down. And he prays a little prayer, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And it's from this prayer that we know for sure that Jesus has put the story into the context of a big act of public worship. The reason we know that is, as the story is given to us, if you're reading it in the language the gospel was first written, there's a very common Greek word for mercy, eleison. And if any of you have had any kind of formal church experience in your background at all, you may be familiar with the little thing that's sort of sung, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. And it can be sung very badly or sometimes very well, but that's what it means. And the Greek word for mercy, eleison, that's what it is. But that's actually not what the guy prays in this prayer. What the guy prays in this prayer, the tax collector, is he prays hilastotoimoi, which means, may there be a propitiation for me. Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, as I said, there's a service that happens every sunrise and every evening in the temple, during which a lamb is sacrificed to take away for sin, to pay the price for sin. Now, I know it's very strange for us to think of paying a price for forgiveness, but if you think about it, almost all forgiveness is very costly. If someone has ever wronged you in a massive way and you're prepared to forgive them, in one sense, you're writing them quite a large emotional check. And when we do things which are wrong, there are very often consequences which come from that. And in order to justify all the aggrieved parties, the question is, well, look, there needs to be some kind of justice here. And what was happening in the temple every morning and every evening was God saying, look, I'm going to find a time when I will pay for what you've done wrong. So these two guys are there both in the same religious place of worship. They both take part in the same service. They both see the same sacrifice take place. And they pray two different prayers. The first guy says, God, I'm great. And the second guy says, may this be for me. May this offer for the forgiveness of sins, may it be for me. May the sacrifice that's being offered up now, I need that. May it be for me. May this act that makes forgiveness possible from you, God, may it be for me. And then Jesus says, I tell you that man, the second guy, went home having been justified before God, having been made right before him, not the former. Now, it's an incredible statement. What Jesus is saying is, look, if you think that some form of religious observance and rule-keeping is going to make you right with me, you're wrong. He's saying, even if you're in the right place, doing the right kind of thing, That's not enough. There's something which is more, which is God isn't interested in our particular religious observation or even us trying to make ourselves right with him. What God is very interested in doing, and what he's made a provision for, is making it possible for us to be right with him from a gift that he offers to us. At the heart of the Christian gospel is a message which is not, if we try hard enough and somehow are sad enough, God will forgive us. That's not what the Christian gospel is about. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but in most cultures, we earn forgiveness. Let's suppose at the end of this meeting, one of you come up and you say, Michael, I have a question for you. And I say, sure, go ahead. And you've got a group of friends with you and you say, well, my question is this. And I look at you and I say, what a stupid question. You, quite clearly, have the intellectual capacity, more commonly associated with forms of pond life, which are invisible to the naked eye. And let's suppose, for some strange reason, you take that response to be insulting. In case you're wondering where that's from, that's a quote from a program called Blackadder, but that's by the by. So I insult you publicly in front of all of your friends. Now, my guess is, at that point, you're going to feel rightly very offended. But let's suppose in a couple of minutes later, when you're still standing there with your friends around you feeling slightly shocked, that I'm now talking to somebody else, and about 1.5 minutes into my next conversation, all of a sudden my lip trembles and I burst into floods of tears. And then I collapse on the floor. I'm weeping so loudly and uncontrollably. Everybody in this room goes quiet and stares in this direction. And then I crawl 5 feet across the floor, literally on my hands and knees, and I hold onto your ankles, and I sob, and I beg you for forgiveness. Now, would you forgive me? You can see your tough audience to please. The answer is you're probably going to forgive me when you think I've suffered enough, when I've been through enough existential angst and guilt, and maybe a couple of bad and embarrassing things have happened to me. Does that make sense? When I have paid a big enough price, and it's very much clear that I've now suffered for the wrong I've done to you, you extend forgiveness to me. You're prepared to let me off. Okay, that's enough. But the message of the Christian gospel isn't we need to earn we can earn somehow favor and forgiveness from God in that way. The message is actually way more profound than that. God offers us forgiveness even before we think of asking for it. A lamb is sacrificed for the forgiveness of sins, and forgiveness is offered as a gift to everybody who is there. One guy feels no need for it because he feels he's perfect. The other one is very much aware of where he's failed, and he says, that needs to be for me. I'm sorry. It's one of the most humbling things in the world to admit you're wrong and to say you're sorry. All of us struggle with it. I wish even today that I was better at it. It's one of the things I'm trying to get better and better at. Because there is something inherently humbling about recognizing that you were wrong and that you need someone else's forgiveness. And this is what this guy has done. He comes and he humbles himself when he sees the price that has been paid for the forgiveness of his sins, and he says, that needs to be for me. And now he goes home with a certainty in his heart. He's right with God. Why? Because he's done something amazing? No. Because he's more clever than the other guy? No. Because he's more morally upright than the other guy? No. The only reason he goes home having been justified before God is that the forgiveness that was offered to him, he said, that needs to be for me. The Christian faith isn't accidentally humbling, and it's not incidentally humbling. It is inherently humbling. It is impossible to hold on to the true gospel of Jesus Christ and to truly become a Christian and have that manifest itself in arrogance. It's impossible. It can't possibly be the case because there is absolutely nothing the Christian has to be superior about. When Jesus Christ was baptized, we read in one of the other gospel accounts that John the Baptist pointed at him and said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus was God come into this world, and he was going to offer himself as a final sacrifice to pay for what we have done wrong, making it possible for all of us to be forgiven and to find peace with him. Now, I can understand why that can be confused with arrogance. Does that make sense? Because it gives a certainty, but it's a different type of certainty. Let's come back to the whole me insulting you thing. Let's supposing I publicly insult you in front of your friends and I belittle you. And the next morning, one of your friends sees me having coffee in Cambridge, And so they walk up to me and they say, I was at that talk last night. That was an interesting way you have handling people's questions at the end of your talk. You know, how's your relationship with Sam, let's say? And I say, you know what? Sam, whose question I was answering last night, has now become my closest friend. There's no one on the earth I am closer to than them. Well, that would seem to be a ridiculous response to your question. Apart from one thing. Let's suppose after I had insulted Sam, insulted you, you hung around until everyone else had gone. And you came up to me and you said, Michael, is everything okay? You know, there's a 24-hour cafe just here in Cambridge. Why don't I buy you a cup of tea? And then they spent all night with me. And as we're there, just drinking tea and talking into the small hours of the morning, I suddenly say, you know what, I am so sorry for what I said about you a few hours ago. I have no idea why I treated you that way, why I made up those things I said about you. I'm so sorry. And as I say sorry, I receive the forgiveness that you've offered to me. And then let's supposing just before your other friend comes to see me, you've just left, and they say to you, how's your relationship with Sam? When I say you're my closest friend, there may not even be a hint of exaggeration in my voice, because if I treat most people that way, I have no friends. But here's the key thing. When I say I'm close to them, is that me being arrogant? And the answer is no. Why can I say that with complete truth? And the answer is because they did something amazing, not me. They were offering me grace, mercy, forgiveness, the possibility of reconciliation, even after I'd insulted them. And when I say sorry, I receive the forgiveness they've offered. And now there's peace. It's one of the most beautiful things in the world. It's why if you ever insult someone, even accidentally, and you apologize, and you receive their forgiveness, the next day when you see them, they can walk into the back of the room 100 feet away, and you just need half a second to look into their face, and you know if you've been forgiven or not. It's the most amazing thing. And if they have truly forgiven you, there is peace. The message of the gospel is God is truly willing to forgive every single one of us if we're prepared to say sorry. But it's a very humbling thing. And then at that point, you find peace with him. There will be the opportunity as we go through this week to actually make and receive that offer of peace from God. But let me just use one final illustration before we move into the final part of this evening. Look, imagine that life, you can organize society onto a bookshelf, into a bookcase. And on the very top shelf of that bookcase, you have international heroes. By that I mean people who are admired and respected around the world. You mention their name, and in almost any country in the world, people go, wow, what an amazing person. There are a handful of people on that kind of shelf. And then imagine on the shelf below that, you have the books of all of the lives of people who aren't maybe famous around the globe, but within their country, they're respected and loved. Does that make sense? The way they lived, the way they treated people, we admire them, we look up to them, we think, wow, what an amazing life. And then on the shelf below that, you've got ordinary, decent, hard-working people who, you know, they're not known by anybody really, but within the circle they're known, they're loved and they're trusted. If you went on holiday, you would give them the keys to your apartment and the keys to your car, and you would say, could you look after my apartment and look after my car while I'm away? And then on the shelf below that, you've got people who live a little bit close to the edge. I mean, they're great to have at parties. Okay, you love hearing the stories of all the crazy stuff they do. You would never lend them your car under any circumstances whatsoever. And then on the shelf below that, you've got people who lie and cheat and steal for a living. And then on the shelf below that, you've got truly evil people. I mean, people who love inflicting pain on other people, like dentists and those kinds of people. And let's suppose I were to give you a pen, and I were to ask you to draw a line of judgment. And I'll say, I'd like you to decide how far down you go before you draw a line and say, well, from this point up, everybody goes to heaven. Well, what most of us do is we tend to look at whatever shelf we're standing on and we draw the line just about there. Okay, from this point on, it's fine. The interesting thing is there will come a time when Jesus said he will draw a line, but he won't draw the line this way across the shelf. He draws it this way. It runs down the middle of the case. Because on one side of that line will be people to whom forgiveness has been offered and they said, yes, God, I'm sorry. And on the other side of the line, people to whom God offered forgiveness and they said, no, I'm not interested. It's very often our pride and arrogance that stops us from being prepared to admit where we've actually struggled in our own life and failed. it is the most liberating and joyful thing in the world to find forgiveness with Christ. And it should be one of the most inherently humbling things. If you have ever met a Christian who seems to be so full of arrogance it's put you off the Christian faith, please don't let you put it off. There are all kinds of reasons why people may claim to be Christian and yet they may not be. To claim isn't the same thing as being one. I was in Oxford and a couple of months ago, and I was just about to fly to Nigeria, and I was in the back of a taxi cab, and the guy driving me was Nigerian. And I got talking with him, and he with me, and when he gave me his name, I said, well, that's a really interesting name. What's the meaning of the name? And he explained the meaning of his name. And I said, that's actually really quite profound. I said, do you believe in God? And he said, well, I used to. He says, but the church that I experienced was so hypocritical and so terrible and so horrible, I want nothing to do with it ever again in my entire life. He says, so I live as an atheist agnostic, I'm just not interested anymore. So I said to him, look, can I ask you a question? I said, as a taxi driver, you've been working as a taxi driver here now for 10 years, has anyone ever given you fake money? And to my surprise, he said, all the time. And then I said, does that mean when we arrive at our destination and I offer you a £20 note, you'll reject it because in the past someone offered you a fake? Well, he was a very sharp guy, and I didn't have to draw the illustration anymore, because I could see from his face reflected in the mirror that he knew exactly where this was going. I said, please don't reject the real offer that's made to you through the person of Jesus Christ, because in the past you've experienced something which is counterfeit. And I would make that same appeal to you today, even if you have in the past been hurt. Don't reject the reality of the forgiveness that God offers us through the person of Jesus Christ and his cross, because in the past you've encountered something counterfeit. Jesus Christ came into this world as the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world. He was willing to have his life sacrificed on the cross in order to make it possible for us to know forgiveness through him. Now, there are three possible ways of responding to this kind of message, which actually include everybody in this room. So we're all going to be in one of these three categories. The first response is, no way. Okay, there's no way I buy that, believe it. Okay, I'm not there. Well, first of all, let me say I'm really happy you're here. I hope it was at least worthwhile you coming. And I would love to talk to you at the end of this meeting. Please come and find me, come and find one of the guys maybe wearing one of the t-shirts, or if you're here at this lunchtime, come and find Pete, who's just sat over there. Come and ask us your questions. That's one of the reasons why we're here. So for some it may be no. For some of you it may be, I'm not sure. Well, I'm really glad you're here. This events week is designed to give everybody the opportunity to look into the Christian faith and decide, is it true? Is it real? Is this right? And you'll see there are some little cards left on your seats, and it says, there's a little box there that says, tell me more. And if you tick that little tell me more box and you leave your name and your email address, then we'll get in contact with you, and we'll find out how we can tell you more. Now, all of this events week, every lunchtime, every evening, there's going to be a talk like this, the lunch times with public Q&A, the evening times just private question and answers after the sessions. You're welcome to come along to that. But following this week, in all of the weeks left of this term, there will be a meeting organised, whose name I've just forgotten. What's the follow-up? Where to from here, called, well, how could I forget that? Where to from here, which allows you to continue to explore what's been said here. And so again, if you just tick the little tell me more and you put your name, then someone will send you details, and maybe someone who's in your college will connect you guys together so you can come along to that together, do that whatever hour it is together once a week, and then go back to college together and so on, so you can talk about it. So if you want to if you're not sure, if you're saying maybe, then do tick that. You'll see there's one other little box on that card, and it says count me in. And what that means is really very simple. If you're sat here this evening and it's almost as if you feel that God has been speaking directly to you. Maybe you've been thinking about this for a while. Maybe this is something you've been wrestling with for a while. You know who Jesus Christ is, that he is God who came into this world. You understand why he gave his life upon the cross, that we may find peace with him and have that eternal life, that we can receive that forgiveness from him, that through his death and his resurrection he makes it possible to be united with him. If that's where you are, and you're saying, I need to say yes this evening, then I would encourage you to do that this evening. If you know it's true and you're sure it's real, and you've been wrestling particularly with this whole question, but isn't it very arrogant? then the answer is no. It's not arrogant to receive a gift that's been offered to you, which is what God is doing through the cross. We call it grace. He's offering us a gift of forgiveness. And if that's where you are, I'm going to offer just a very, very short prayer. It's going to last about 20 seconds or less. And it basically just says, God, I want to thank you that you stepped into this world and you offered yourself for me, that I might know this peace and forgiveness with you. And it's also a little prayer that says, and I'm going to follow you wherever I go. But please don't pray this if you're not sure. If you're in the, well, look, I'm not sure about this, tell me more, that's fine. If you're sitting here and you're saying, no, I'm just not buying into that at all, then if you could give us that 20 seconds, then afterwards you can come running up to the front, grab me by the lapels and say, I've got a question for you. And I'll do my very best to try and answer it. But I say, if you are in that position where you know you need to say yes, then I will just invite you, just where you are, to very slowly, in the quietness of your own heart and mind, just repeat this simple prayer after me. And this is what it is. Dear God, I want to thank you that you both know me and love me. And I thank you, Jesus, that you came into this world as the Lamb of God to take away my sin. And I am sorry for what I've done. And I thank you for the offer of peace and forgiveness you extend to me through the cross. Lord, I pray that may I not just know your forgiveness, but teach me what it is to walk with you, whatever it may cost me. Amen. Well, look, if you did make that your prayer, and you meant that, then please do tick the Count Me In box. Leave a way to contact you, because as brilliant as the students are here, if you tick Count Me In and you don't leave your name and email, it's very hard to decipher. Although we could, I suppose, get enough handwriting experts to start narrowing down the potential field of where you're from. I say, if you have the Tell Me More, then two things can happen. Someone will be in contact with you, and I'm going to make a promise I think we can fulfill, that within 24 hours, if you tick Tell Me More, someone will be in contact with you. You are not going to be embarrassed. We're not going to send someone round to wherever you are, your lab or your department with a guitar, or to your staircase, singing songs and hymns to you, underneath the gap underneath your door. But there are a group of people here, some of whom come from overseas, some are here from the UK, who are here this week, and they will be more than happy to have a cup of coffee with you and for you to ask their questions. Now, if you're sitting here and you're an atheist, especially if you're a committed atheist, you may be morally obliged to tick Tell Me More and to take up their time. Let me explain why. The people who've come here are going to be sharing about how Jesus Christ changed their life. And inevitably, over the course of this week, some people will become Christians. And if you're a very committed atheist, you must surely believe there's something wrong about that. And not only that, it takes time and money to do this. And if you ask them to take you out for coffee, they're going to have to spend their money on you. Now, if they don't spend their money on you, they're going to spend it on someone else. So it's time to take a hit for the team and absorb these resources that could be directed against someone else. And so if you are in that category, do feel free to tick the Tell Me More. You may even want to write down the question that you have, and then it will be a delight for either one of the students here, or one of the team that are visiting this week, to sit down, try to take your question as serious as we can, and try to give the best answer that we can. Well, I want to thank you first and foremost for staying awake. I'm very grateful about that. I've only just returned from Asia myself, so I'm on an 8-hour time difference. So for right now, for me, it's about 4 o'clock in the morning. And so it really does feel like I'm sleep talking. But most of you stayed awake, and that is encouraging for me. Please do remember about coming back tomorrow lunchtime. You will really regret it if you don't listen to what Pete has to say. And obviously, I would love to see you in the evening. And I was going to say that I'd like to see more people in the evening at the lunchtime, but that would be very arrogant and presumptuous of me. So I'll ask for forgiveness later. Otherwise, thank you very much. Let me hand back to Susie, and thank you so much for giving me a hearing.